About 12 months ago. I own none of these. Guess I'm a reader now. You know, part of me wishes I read less audiobooks this year. The stack could be a whole lot higher. Here we are at the end of 2019. At the beginning of 2019, I set out to read one book a week. So here I am filming 12 months later. And I guess the question is, did I do it? Short answer, no, I did not read one book per week. However, I did manage to read 52 books in 52 weeks. I did not establish a consistent habit. And this really led me to examine while I was doing the challenge in the first place. Was it to establish a habit of reading, or was it to gain the knowledge and insight from 52 separate books? I will talk more about this in the next video. Unlike the last two videos I did, I'm going to split this into two different sections. One, a reading recap of what I ended up reading for the year, or the second half in this case, and then I'll do a more long-form video for the next one, kind of talking about how this challenge changed my life, and or rather, if it did, and go into talk about if I think it's worth it, if I'll be doing it again, and what have you. So we're gonna go in chronological order. You shouldn't have seen any of these yet. My last update in July, I think it was, I read 25 books, so this is the remaining 27 books of the year. A lot of the ones at the end were a little short. I went into December, I think, 12 behind, so I need to read 16 books in the month. So there is a few shorter ones. Read a lot of philosophy to kind of stat pad out those numbers. I try to keep most of them above 50 and 100 pages. At the end of the year, my Goodreads account said I did read an average page count of 231 per book. So I don't think that's terrible, but it could be longer in the future. Okay, let's jump in. Similar to my last video, I'm going to be doing a short review of the book, kind of what it reads like, what it's about, and then if I would recommend it or not. Starting off, I have Tribe by Sebastian Junger. Now, this was a very interesting book. Sebastian kind of uses almost a journalistic style to talk about the brotherhood in the military. And what he's arguing in this book is that the brotherhood and the struggle and the connection, the tribe that is formed between people in the military actually serves for like a better mental health state. And in fact, he goes on to say it's the lack of community and support that ends up causing a lot of the PTSD that people can't overcome once they get back home. It's an interesting book, kind of on the psychological side. There was not a lot of sources, however, so I don't know how much of this is scientifically backed versus just his viewpoint on the situation. I would recommend it. It was a good book. It was fairly short. It was a quick read. I think I put it down in 2 days or so. Then we have a book I've loaned out, Incognito by David Eagleman. This book reminds me a lot of Phantoms in the Brain by Ramachandran, in that it talks about like the inner workings of the mind. Now, while Ramachandran's book talked about mental disorders, such as when a patient has a stroke in a certain area and basically turns off that section of the brain, what happens? This book talks about mainly a standard working brain. It dives into split brain theory. It goes into talking about how the mind may operate more of a democracy where different parts vote on what the decision is, and then it comes up with what it actually does based off that. Super interesting book. I would highly recommend this one. Microdosing Psychedelics by Paul Austin. This was a very interesting book. I actually picked it up, I believe, while researching books on business and entrepreneurship. Silicon Valley's got a big thing about doing LSD right now. This almost serves as like a practical guide. It talks about the different psychedelics that you can microdose with. It talks about the effects that they have, dosing protocols, but it ends kind of weird. He has a section all about leadership and almost feels very political, like he's pushing an agenda. If you can find a copy of this, I recommend giving it a read. It is interesting, but I don't know if I would pick it up again personally. When Breath Becomes Air. Now, this was probably one of my favorite books of the year. This book is about a 36-year-old neurosurgeon that ends up getting diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. In this book, he has to kind of figure out what makes life worth living, what makes him happy, if he should keep going or not. It reads more like a novel than a nonfiction, so I won't spoil too much of the plot line, but I would highly recommend this. The Dip by Seth Godin. Now, this is a business book, basically talking about his concept of a dip. Basically, how you can get a lot done in business at the start, then you hit a trough where things get a little hard, and then experience exponential returns. He argues that you want to really push through that hard part to get those exponential returns, and that's where most people fail and you can succeed. I do think part of this book is a little flawed in that he basically assumes that if you're not trying to be the number one at whatever you're doing, that there's no purpose. I disagree with that. You can make plenty of livings being in a market or industry that you're not the best. That being said, it was pretty motivational and I recommend it. Game Changers by Dave Asprey. This was a fun read. It is separated into 46 different sections, all about self-improvement from like almost a biohacking aspect. Talks about smart drugs, talks about different protocols for like blocking light, how to learn better, genetic testing to figure out when's the best time for you to sleep. And it's super interesting. That being said, a few of the laws feel kind of pseudoscience-y, so do keep that in mind going into this. We Are All Racist. This is by Alan Lewis, PhD. He is actually a professor at the University of Virginia, somewhat local to me, and I actually picked this up used from a local store. I don't know how readily you can find this, considering on Goodreads I was like one of 10 people that have read it. That might be a slight exaggeration, and I'm not looking at Goodreads at the moment, but it is definitely not a super popular book. That might just because it's a local thing or because of the content. I'm not really sure. The content in the book seemed pretty sound to me. It's talking about how cultural bias is almost something that's inherent to humans on a very primal and basic level, but how to overcome that, and in particular how Black communities can use that knowledge to kind of rebuild themselves and get back ahead. Greatest Salesman in the World by Og Mandino. Now, this is a book that I really didn't want to pick up. The title seems very cheesy, and it seems like a very cringy kind of self-help, self-motivational book. A lot of these YouTube gurus would kind of talk about in a 2-minute intro ad. That being said, it was actually a fun read. It's more of a philosophy on selling and being a good person within business than it is about anything else. I wouldn't say it's inspirational. I wouldn't say it has super actionable advice, but if you need something to read about business and about philosophy of business, it's fun. Then we get to a book that I have at work at the moment, The Designer's Dictionary of Color. Now, this book I actually picked up from a local museum, and the reason I picked this up is because I do work in the wedding and event industry. And I use this more as a reference when picking out color palettes. So the book is comprised of a lot of different primary colors, or rather a lot of different colors in the spectrum. And it goes into the cultural significance of each one of those colors, its pairing, and then uses some sample photos for references of how those colors are used. Personally, I have it at work because I've used it, and it's beneficial if you're if you are in any type of field that you need a little bit of color theory to kind of get a little step forward. Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. This was a super interesting book. I don't think the title gives it enough credit, actually. It is marketed as another one of those business books, but this isn't good for just business. In this book, Chris Voss, who does negotiations for the FBI, talks about all the different tactics they developed when working with terrorist organizations, hostage scenarios, and bank robberies. How to basically talk somebody down or convince somebody over onto the same side as you. So even if you're just buying a used car, this book's beneficial. Good to Great. Good to Great by Jim Collins is probably the most well-sourced book I've read in a moment. This book is a study on businesses that have outperformed the market for quite a number of years, and then it compares them to other other businesses in the same market or industry that have failed to do so. This picks out 15 companies, compares them to 15 in the same industry, and picks out different tactics that they used to get ahead. So if you're an entrepreneur, I definitely recommend this book. Otherwise, if you're just into nonfiction in general, I don't know if there's terribly much value in it. Then we have Free Will by Sam Harris. This is more of an essay than a full book. I know the audiobook I read here on YouTube was only about an hour and a half. The essay is probably only 60 to 80 pages if I had to guess, based off of the time the audiobook took. Now, it's all based around a study that showed that the brain comes up with decisions slightly before the mind is cognizant of it. I believe they use an MRI machine to see which areas of the brain acted up to lead to certain decisions, and they could actually predict people's decisions before they were cognizant of it, thus leading Sam to question if free will is just an illusion. Super interesting book. I have read a few reviews about it, and some of the science seems to be controversial, so I would go into it with that frame of reference, but interesting nonetheless. All right, then we have The Enchiridion by Epictetus. Epictetus was a philosopher of Stoic thought, and The Enchiridion reads as a handbook on what he thinks you should do to have a happy and tranquil life. This is a book that requires a lot of rereading to fully ingrain all the messages. If you want to follow Stoic thought, I think it has a lot of valuable tidbits, and I would highly recommend it. Continuing with ancient books, I have The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Personally, I did not get a lot of value out of the aspects of the book that are talking about fighting on swampy and mountainous terrain, but that's just me. I know a lot of entrepreneurs swear by this book, saying that the messages taught about warfare can really help you get ahead, but it seems a little abstract to me and not really applicable to my life. It is an interesting read. It's fairly short, and I'd recommend picking it up. Then we have Lying by Sam Harris. Like the last Sam Harris book, this is more of an essay, 60 to 80 pages, and pretty short if you're wanting to consume it on YouTube. It is online in audiobook form, about an hour and a half long. This is all about the damaging aspects of lying, even white lies, and how he basically prescribes a always honest type of policy. It's a little black and white, but it is an interesting read nonetheless. Alright, going back to hard copies. Got The Social Leap by Wim von Hippel. This is an interesting book. It's kind of like evolutionary. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Sapiens, but more narrow. Now, this book talks about how humans basically used social interactions to evolve faster than any other animal, and what that led us to do. It also talks about how we are skewed to still have the same reward responses in ourselves, and why we get addicted to things like Netflix and the internet, and basically how sugary food really impacts our evolutionary drives. It's an interesting book. I would recommend it. Then we have The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. I do want to read more of the original works of different economic systems, philosophers, and what have you. And that's what led me to end up picking up this. Now, the Communist Manifesto, I'm sure most of you know what it is. I would recommend it. There's a lot I did not agree with in it, but I felt like I'm a more well-rounded person for reading it. The Death of Socrates by Plato. This was a fun audiobook to listen to. If you're not familiar, Plato, of course, was an early philosopher. Socrates was his teacher. Socrates didn't write down a lot of his work. So in this play, Plato really romanticizes Socrates, but it really shows you a lot about what Socrates valued, even to the point of putting his values above his life and then getting sentenced to death for it. Recommend it. It's a fun listen. All right, down to the home stretch. We have Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. This was a fun book. I thought it was going to be more self-helpy than it was, but it's more actually of a psychology book. It talks about why we're bad at remembering the past and predicting the future. Basically not to trust yourself with what's going to actually make you happy, but kind of look at the situation objectively. Basically reinforcing you to look deeper about what truly is going to make you happy in life. Recommend picking this one up. Then we have On the Shortness of Life by Seneca. This is another philosophical work. To distill it all into one sentence is basically living every moment to the fullest. I'd recommend picking this up for sure. Then we have the Symposium by Plato, another philosophical work. This one is pretty fun, especially reading it in the modern era. So this is all about the true meaning of love, and it's Socrates and a bunch of other guys sitting around the table debating about what the true meaning of love is. It's kind of weird, pretty funny, and definitely interesting. On audiobook, I also read Brief Answers to the Big Questions by Stephen Hawking. This is a super interesting book. One of the things I don't like about a lot of nonfiction is they'll tell you about what they learned about a certain topic in hopes of finding the answer, not being able to find the answer, and then they'll drop it right there. This one, it actually speculates about how things could be. And for that, I appreciate it. It's very, very interesting, and you do pick up a lot of science along the way. Then we have We Should All Be Feminist. It's a pretty short, pretty insightful book, basically talking about the term feminism. She starts off by having the term used against her derogatory, and then ends up owning it and basically argues why everybody should be feminist. I agree. Worth a read. It's also probably the most popular books on this list as far as good read reviews go. Then we have Dead Aid. Now, Dead Aid was an interesting one. It's basically an argument onto why most first world countries need to cut off aid to Africa, how it basically leads to more corruption than it does actually helping out the community. Instead, it argues that we need to make more investments versus free aid, because most of the aid doesn't go into the hands of the population itself. Interesting read. It would not be on the top of my recommendations, however. Then we have Think Like a Freak. Now, Think Like a Freak is from the creator of Freakonomics, and it's super interesting. It's a few shorter stories within one larger narrative about basically thinking about things differently than one might traditionally approach a situation. For example, one of the topics is talking about legalizing abortion, lowering crime. Pretty controversial. They explain why it shouldn't be, but it's pretty interesting. I give it a read. Biohackers. Now, this book I did not finish early in the year, and I actually picked it up to finish off my reading challenge for the year. It is very dry. That being said, I do think it's a valuable read, but it was hard for me to get through. Basically talks about how the hacker culture, specifically like computer hackers, are influencing the biohacking movement, and basically argues a case for open science. If you're into biohacking, it's worth reading, but it is not a fun read for me personally. Then to finish off the year, we have Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks. Now this book goes into a variety of different hallucinations of sight, hallucinations of smell, hearing, what have you, caused by mental disorders, as well as neurodegenerative diseases, as well as hallucinogenic drugs. Super interesting book. I feel like it really drags on towards the end, and it feels kind of repetitive as far as talking about the different experiences people have. That being said, it was a fun read, super interesting. I'd recommend it. And that's all we got. So that's 27 nonfiction books. That was the second half of my 52 book challenge for the year. I hope you found something valuable out of this video. As always, I'll link to these books in the description below. I'll also drop my Insta and Goodreads. I should have a few more videos coming out for you in early 2020. Let me know what else you'd like to see from this channel in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you soon.